Welcome to episode 2 of There and Back Again, A Hippie's Tale, a little bit of a side path on the Road to Shalom podcast channel. Thanks for coming. In this episode, we're going to try to get back on the road right where we left town on the first episode, and that was the world of white middle America in the 50s. Our next stop on our trip is a quick visit to the decade historian Paul Johnson gave the ominous title, America's Suicide Attempt, the 60s. But before we leave town, I want to share just a couple of guiding thoughts for us that I hope will be a sort of mental GPS for our entire journey. Based on some really thoughtful listener feedback I got on the first episode, I think it's kind of important for me to draw a better picture of the boundaries and limitations of our journey, kind of the banks within this river of reminiscing is going to flow. First thing I want you to know is that it's not possible for us to unpack, much less expose, most of what was happening across the socio-ethnic landscape of America during the years we're talking about. Remember, if we were in a plane, I said we'd be flying at about 50,000 feet. Why this limitation? Well, I mentioned this before, but one thing, it's beyond my own experience. I simply wasn't exposed to what was happening among people of color and immigrant families while I was growing up. I mean, my own family had its own struggles. My dad never finished high school. He worked 7-day weeks my entire childhood running a dry cleaning business. And his primary customers were people with lots of cash and the emblems that go with it, executives from 2 large paper companies nearby. In fact, my mom and dad were kind of the equivalent, at least in our little town of 2,500, of the help in Catherine Stockett's 2009 book by that same title. 6 of us lived in a 900 square foot house. I mean, there was certainly white privilege in my world, but my whole world was white, and the only privilege I saw I couldn't enjoy. My friends drove Cadillacs and T-Birds because that's what their parents had. I drove a Ford station wagon because that's what my parents had, all right? I, like the majority of Americans at the time, was simply isolated from the larger world. I had no idea what was going on in Los Angeles or Chicago growing up in Nakusa, Wisconsin. And to be fair, if you had lived back then, honestly, you wouldn't have either. We had one phone, it hung on the wall, and the line was shared by 3 other families in our neighborhood in what was known back then as the party line. Also, and please don't be offended, but for many of you listening, if it hadn't been for Tim Berners-Lee, you wouldn't be as informed as you are today either. He's the guy that developed the HTML programming language that made it possible to combine text and graphics on computer screens around 1993. Back then, it was called the World Wide Web. You simply know it as the internet. And beloved, if you're older than 27 years old, there's never been a day in your life when it wasn't around. And along with it, the pathway to most of what you know about the world outside your own city. And I mean, let's just be honest, we'd all be a ton more ignorant than we are if others hadn't done a ton of the heavy lifting for us to learn the stuff that we now know. I mean, much of what we know today about the darker side of American history is the fruit of the sweat equity of others. I mean, movies like Mississippi Burning in 1988 and The Ghost of Mississippi in 1996 brought the murder of 3 civil rights activists and the assassination of black activist Medgar Evers into the public eye. The movie The Tuskegee Airmen in 1995, and even the more recent movie Hidden Figures about the 3 black women doing crucial work for NASA, yet still segregated from everyone else on the project because of their race and gender. All of this informed us of the racial repression and the deep segregation in the military during World War II. And then you can look at books like Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in an Age of Colorblindness, and Christina Cleveland's book, Disunity in Christ. Both of these have done a ton to educate us about our broken justice system and the racial disparity and division among evangelicals in the mid-20th century. And even the larger truth is that you and I didn't do all the work. They did. We know because they told us. Now, all that to say, there's a ton of truth out there now that wasn't there a half-century ago. There was, in fact, a whole lot of ignorance, in the truest sense of the word, for most folks until the 70s at least. And remember, our journey is there and back again. So, please be patient. And, beloved, I'd urge you to be a little bit humble as well. Trust me, by the time we get to the present, there'll no longer be an excuse for not knowing, and from within the world where I live, or try to live, as a follower of Jesus, there won't be any excuse for not caring either. All right, so let's get the car started and get back on the road. As a Roman Catholic kid who grew up in a small town in Wisconsin, I seriously can't ever forget the excitement that swept over our little parochial grade school when we learned that America had a new president who was both young and Catholic. He was charming and witty. His wife seemed to be plucked out of the pages of a storybook. And believe it or not, there were children living in the White House. It was almost magical. John F. Kennedy and Jackie had indeed brought Camelot to Washington, D.C. As a 10-year-old kid, it sure seemed like the best of times. It would never have even occurred to me just how radically different my life would be by the time I was 20. But the momentum of the 50s was still really strong. Life still was good, or at least we were still enjoying it. And personal enjoyment was the standard by which things were judged as good or bad back then. All right. By now, rock and roll was a permanent fixture in everything having to do with being young. It was the social axis around which our entire lives seemed to rotate. My own involvement in rock music began during the 60s, beginning with playing bass for a popular dance band in high school, and then building to kind of a zenith in college with a talented folk rock group. Heck, I even did warm-up for a couple of major groups back in the era. All right. As the 60s began, its music reflected a world literally obsessed with fun, and that world seemed to orbit three predictable themes: teen romance, fast cars, and surfing. There were more bands and solo artists than one could imagine, but the supergroup, at least for us white middle American kids in the decade's early years, was a group called the Beach Boys. They wove all three of these dominant youth themes into a musical fantasy that appealed to any teenager with functioning hormones. In fact, Rolling Stone magazine made this comment about the Beach Boys as late as 1976, over 15 years later. All right, here's what they said. Here's what Rolling Stone magazine said. In the 60s, when they were at the height of their original popularity, the Beach Boys propagated their own variant on the American dream, painting a dazzling picture of beaches, parties, and endless summers, a paradise of escape into private as often as shared pleasures. In surfing, the Beach Boys had hit upon a potent image: leisure, mobility, and privacy. It was the suburban myth transported to the Pacific Ocean. California in 1963. It was the one place west of the Mississippi where everyone wanted to be. Rich and fast, cars, women, one suburban plot for everyone, a sea of happy humanity sandwiched between frosty mountains and toasty beaches, all an easy drive down the freeway. That was what we were all thinking of when we listened to the Beach Boys. Matter of fact, if you just do a flyover of their discography from between 1962 and 66, the song titles tell it all. I mean, Surfin' USA in 1963, Surfer Girl the same year, Little Deuce Coupe the same year, Fun, Fun, Fun a year later, California Girls in 1965, Barbara Ann in 1966, Good, Good, Good Vibrations in 1966. I mean, between 63 and 75, the Beach Boys cranked out 28 albums. I'm serious. Their musical fantasies did a great deal to perpetuate what some called an uncomplicated suburban utopia. And I can tell you, as a fully functioning adolescent, I found myself contemplating visions of bikinis and making skateboards literally out of scrap lumber and broken roller skates. There weren't even such a thing as rollerblades. Something unheard of, all of this in the frozen hinterlands of Wisconsin. I, along with everyone my age, was wishing they could all be California girls rather than studying racial injustice or the conflict in Indochina. All right. At the dawn of my teen years, the only black person I had ever even seen was Hank Aaron when my Boy Scout troop took a bus trip to watch the Braves play in Milwaukee. I had no idea that Motown Records had been formed 3 months before I turned 10 years old. Even though oddly, and I still can't figure this out, I went to sleep every night listening to Ray Charles records. Speaking of music, by the decade's end, at least one permanent racial integration would have been achieved. Soul music would soon put black faces and black music in front of a whole lot of white folk. The Temptations, the Supremes, the Jackson 5, Stevie Wonder, Aretha Franklin, and a host of others would be household names before I hit the college campus. But I didn't know that. And for the most part, all of this would be happening under the radar anyway, because what was soon to be on the radar would get a whole lot more airtime and, as usual, a whole lot more ink. Now, as the youth culture began to gobble up more and more of the record market, the inevitable happened. Guitar sales skyrocketed, and a growing number of young kids decided that they wanted to be rock and roll stars as well. I was one of them. And as a result, it seemed like almost overnight, the thoughts and feelings of American youth, rather than those dictated by the record company producers, began to leak into our music. The standard themes of teenage sexuality and the adventure, well, yeah, they hung around. But a new kind of music hybrid began to encroach on rock and roll's hallowed ground. Folk music, or folk rock to be more precise. And it had much more thoughtful and agitating messages than what the Beach Boys were giving us. And one of the many faces of this new hybrid music was a young man from the Iron Range in Minnesota named Robert Zimmerman. He migrated east, got to the East Coast, changed his name to Bob Dylan, and became a permanent fixture in American pop history. He wasn't a vocal superstar, but man, could he write lyrics. The content of his lyrics totally eclipsed his lack of vocal talent. His induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame 20 years later also listed 5 of his songs as major shapers of rock music. In some ways, Dylan was to the 60s what Elvis was to the 50s, kind of the Velcro holding a generation of lost children together. Yet to fully appreciate the pathos of this music, we need to examine some lesser streams of the larger culture, which in many ways was responsible for becoming a raging torrent. Let's take a little detour down 3 ideological side streets that will lead us right back to Main Street, where Dylan and a few of the Pied Pipers of the 60s will be waiting for us. And the first side street, and by side street, I don't mean they weren't important. I mean, there's going to be 3 things that are going to find themselves weaving themselves together into a huge, raging torrent of unrest by the time we get to the end of the decade. But the first one we need to visit is the Civil Rights Movement. And as early as the mid-50s, with the Supreme Court decision, Brown versus Board of Education, they had ruled that segregation was unconstitutional in the institutions of higher learning. But the old dictum that you can't legislate morality was proved true. In 1957, President Eisenhower had to send troops into Arkansas to force the governor to comply with desegregation orders. President Kennedy used the same tactic about 5 years later in the case of James Meredith on the University of Mississippi campus. Kennedy made a strong statement about the state of our disunion when he said this: 100 years of delay have passed since President Lincoln freed the slaves. Yet their heirs, their grandsons, are not fully free. And this nation, for all its hopes and all its boasts, will not be fully free until all its citizens are free. It was about this same time that Alabama Governor George Wallace blocked black students, 3 of them, from entering the University of Alabama. This was supposedly a show of his commitment to keep his famous segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever promise he had made at his recent inauguration as governor. In August of that same year, 200,000 supporters gathered to hear a black Baptist minister who advocated a nonviolent approach to the civil rights issue deliver a speech at the Washington Monument. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s words, "I have a dream," was permanently etched into the American consciousness that day, and would become one of the top 100 speeches of the 20th century. I'd be shocked if any of you are not only familiar with those words, but know exactly how they sounded because you've heard it on sound bites from that speech. Dr. King was a charismatic organizer who brought a sense of solidarity to the civil rights cause. He had sympathetic supporters among a growing number of white college students as well as in the black community. As a matter of fact, many whites participated in an effort to register black voters in the South in the early 60s, traveling to the Deep South in what was known as the Mississippi Summer Project. Some of them learned there was another side to Southern hospitality that wasn't so hospitable. My own city of Birmingham was given the degrading name of Bombingham because between 1947 and 1965, at least 50 racially motivated bombings had occurred. A few months before his Washington speech, King had been arrested in Birmingham and wrote his famous letter from a Birmingham jail. A month after his Washington speech, the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham was bombed, killing 4 children, and that became one of the most highly publicized acts of terror in our country's history. But there were also some among the black community who became impatient with what they perceived as slowness in Dr. King's diplomatic style of civil disobedience. They advocated a faster method of securing racial justice. And so portions of the civil rights movement turned decidedly militant during the mid-60s, especially after the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. And one of the more visible groups was the Black Panther Party. Huey Newton, Bobby Seale, and Eldridge Cleaver were to become familiar names on campuses throughout the country. As a matter of fact, Cleaver's book, Soul on Ice, was required reading in my sophomore sociology class, along with the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx and Frederick Engels. You know, the older, less violent civil rights organizations such as Stokely Carmichael's Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and others began to kind of lose their notoriety and clout as the Black Panthers and their predominantly white counterparts in the anti-war movement gained momentum and power. And, as always, they gained a spot on the evening news. Things were heating up for sure. Okay, the second side street that we need to take a little trip down is the Vietnam War. Before JFK even stepped over the threshold of the Oval Office to assume his duties as president, Vietnam was already one of America's largest and costliest commitments anywhere in the world. President Eisenhower had deliberately refused to involve the United States in the battle over the 17th parallel during his own administration, but shortly before he got out from underneath the public eye, he lamented this. Here's what he said. The loss of South Vietnam would set in motion a crumbling process that could, as the process progressed, have a grave consequences for us and for our freedom. This idea would later be politicized and weaponized as what would become known as the domino theory. In 1964, the North Vietnamese attacked our destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin, and the result was the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, which gave President Johnson the authority to escalate our involvement to full-scale war, which he did 6 months later after a devastating attack by the North Vietnamese called the Tet Offensive. So the 50s rebel without a cause of white middle America lost his job about this time because the Vietnam War was a conflict that grew to be one of the causes in what would be known as the movement in just a few years. And it wouldn't be long before militant groups like the Weathermen would be chanting, "Bring the war home," instead of "Bring the boys home." You know, in all its vagueness, the anti-war sentiment towards Vietnam kind of became synonymous with the 60s, especially if you were living in white middle America. Vietnam was one cause for the rebels of the decade. The other lightning rod, of course, was the growing social awareness of the plight of people of color in the land of red, white, and blue. And to be fair, the civil rights movement was much, much older than the anti-war movement. Its visible origins went back to the early mid-50s, perhaps even earlier than that. But what about the nation as a whole? Well, 3 months after Dr. King told the world he had a dream, it seemed like the U.S. had a nightmare. Some 60s historians point to the assassination of President Kennedy in November of 63 as the day the militant activist 60s began and the age of passive innocence ended. By mid-decade, race riots and war protests had erupted in nearly 60 cities, killing at least 141 people and injuring more than 4,500. Assassinations of Martin Luther King, Bobby Kennedy in 1968 added a whole lot more fuel to this fire. And the catchphrase on buttons around college campuses had been, "Give a damn." But by the decade's end, according to one historiographer, giving a damn had become a bitter, angry thing. And I want to camp on this for a moment because I think it's really important. This whole era had almost a hypnotic effect on those of us in college at the time. It was almost as if someone had actually followed Abby Hoffman's half-serious suggestion to put LSD in the drinking water. My own brother was in Vietnam and was soon to be seriously wounded by mortar fire while I was skipping classes, mindlessly brandishing my black armband, which I believed was evidence of my solidarity with the movement. But in fairness, honestly, in fairness to us kids from middle America, I have to tell you that life on the college campus was confusing at best. We were away from home for the first time, sitting under the teaching of professors who were eager to destroy not only our faith, but our confidence in all of the leaders in our lives, with the exception of them, of course, right? That's how that works. I mean, pictures of Viet Cong blown beyond recognition or of innocent Vietnamese children with military people with guns in their faces circulated throughout the dozens of new underground newspapers which seemed to operate on the principle that it wasn't true if it wasn't offensive. Confusion reigned in the very institutions built to teach wisdom. In fact, the professors were often the ones telling us of American imperialism, and that the plight of what they called the third world was actually the fault of the United States. It was our capitalistic greed that should be on trial. We were actually urged to commit ourselves to the cause of North Vietnam, to become what some people called the Americong, all right, playing off the word Viet Cong. Political rhetoric was everywhere on the college campus, from the classroom to the lunchroom. I mean, even the restroom graffiti, for crying out loud, took a leftist bend away from the typical sexual themes. By the mid to late 60s on the college campus, the anti-war movement seemed to have eclipsed the civil rights movement in notoriety. Not in actual importance, but just in terms of visibility. In fact, militant student groups like the Weathermen had kidnapped the Black Panther motif of urban guerrillas out of its original ethnic context and transferred it wholesale to the anti-war effort. Supporters of the political left may disagree with me on this, but I think many white middle-class kids in the anti-war machine hijacked legitimate black causes and turned them into excuses for white excesses. I was one of them. It became an excuse just to act out and to act up. All right, so what was the net gain for all the noise? I mean, was it raising the collective conscience of American youth, particularly those on the campuses? All right, although I had a few friends who were reading Karl Marx and Franz Fanon, if you asked the majority of us exactly what it was about Vietnam that we were protesting, we couldn't have told you. There was just this kind of sense that a war between generations was on, and you better pick a side. Each of us kind of felt like the Omega Man from that old movie, and that the destiny of the world hinged on who came out on top. A then lesser-known musician named Stephen Stills wrote a song for his group Buffalo Springfield in response to curfew laws that had been enacted on the Sunset Strip in Hollywood to keep young people from plugging up traffic. All right, that song was eventually hijacked like everything else and converted into a banner song for the counterculture because it supposedly captured just how we felt. That song was called For What It's Worth. And here's a little snippet of it, all right? There's something happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there telling me I've got to beware. Paranoia strikes deep. Into your life it will creep. It starts when you're always afraid. Step out of line, the men come and take you away. You better stop. Hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down. You know, racial and political unrest wormed its way into the lyrics of folk rock singers and onto the airwaves of America. Even the folk rock group I was in, the Union Street Fog, in my sophomore year, began to write songs about the uncivil civil war that was tearing our country apart. I mean, you can just do a little sampling of the lyrics from a handful of folk rock artists from that era, and it illustrates exactly what I'm talking about. I mean, Bob Dylan wrote a song in 1963 called Blowin' in the Wind, and Peter, Paul, and Mary recorded that same song 3 weeks after he did because they worked for the same agent. But in that song, Dylan said this: "How many deaths will it take till he knows that too many people have died?" The 1949 real classic folk singer Pete Seeger wrote a song and performed it at the communist dinner for the Communist Party of the United States, and it was later picked up in 1962 by the supergroup Peter, Paul, and Mary. And it said this: "If I had a hammer, I'd hammer out a warning. It's the hammer of justice. It's the bell of freedom all over this land." In 1965, a rather he wasn't a real famous guy, but a guy named Barry McGuire came out with a song called The Eve of Destruction. I want to just read a couple lyrics to you from that. "Think of all the hate there is in Red China. Then take a look around to Selma, Alabama. Ah, you may leave here for 4 days in space, but when you return, it's the same old place. The pounding of the drums, the pride and disgrace. You can bury your dead, but don't leave a trace. Hate your neighbor next door, but don't forget to say grace. And you tell me over and over and over and over again, my friend, you don't believe we're on the eve of destruction." And a couple years later, Joan Baez recorded a song called Saigon Bride. "How many dead men will it take to build a dike that will not break? How many children must we kill before we make the waves stand still?" You know, it's quite a jump from Elvis's little phrase, "Lay off my blue suede shoes," from the 50s, or the Beach Boys, "I wish they all could be California girls," right? Long, long jump. The 60s was a decade of intensity. In less than 5 years, we had witnessed the assassinations of President Kennedy, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., and Bobby Kennedy. All of that happened between 8th grade and my high school graduation for me. Seemed like all the good guys were getting shot. And then you roll into that, just the free-floating angst, the gradual erosion of the peaceful sector of the Black rights movement, the unbridled and unguided militant demonstration and destruction by students under the banner of peace, and then finish it off with the merger of the political left and the flower children into what historians have collectively just called the counterculture, and you've pretty much got the cultural climate of the decade. It's a whole long way from I Love Lucy in the 50s, don't you think? If feelings had been de-emphasized in the 50s, the 60s were ruled by feelings rather than facts. The stronger the commitment, the more righteous the action. All right, let's turn down the 3rd Street and come back to Main Street. Any history of the 60s would be incomplete without at least some discussion of this vital ingredient, all right? If rock and roll was the state religion and the political left were the high priests, then drugs could easily be labeled the national sacrament of the 60s. Scholars have argued for years, like the chicken and the egg, which came first, the rocker or the doper. But the lyrics and lifestyles of the rock stars certainly perpetuated and nearly canonized the drug scene. But drugs were also a part of the beat culture in the 50s, which had virtually nothing to do with rock and roll. There was something more at work here, I think. An important part of understanding the legacy of drug use in the 60s, all right, is the concept of ideology. Civil rights movement and the anti-war movement were both rooted in ideologies about human equality. In the 60s, drugs were an integral part of an entire anti-establishment worldview that was dangled before us and which we obviously gladly accepted, all right, I admit that. But drug use was part of a larger ideology. It was not just a behavioral thing. The drug problem of the 80s, popularized by the so-called war on drugs, was certainly the offspring of the 60s lifestyle. But that's where I think the similarity ends. Even today, our present opioid crisis, there's no intellectual or personal quest behind it. It might be hedonistic, it might be addictive bondage, or maybe it's just escapist stupidity, but it's surely not ideological. Now listen, don't hear me trying to evade the legitimate guilt and blame that should fall upon my generation, all right? We let more than one cultural killer out of the cage in our era. I'm just trying to help you understand what was going on at that time. To clarify that, although pleasure was certainly one of the byproducts of the drug use back then, it was not the only thing driving the car. A bunch of us honestly believed that drugs were the magic key to raising our nation's consciousness and hopefully awakening its conscience. It was a grand illusion, to be sure, don't get me wrong, but it was a genuine belief among many of those who smoked, dropped, and shot the drugs of the decade. I mean, here's a description of one California drug chemist that I think bridges the connection between drugs and the worldview of the counterculture. Listen to this. Expert chemists like the Bay Area's Owsley Stanley, who set up underground laboratories and fabricated potent and pure LSD tablets in the hundreds of thousands, were not in it just for the money. They kept their prices down, gave out plenty of free samples, and fancied themselves as dispensers of miracles at the service of a new age. They saw themselves as architects of social change with a mission to change the world. In other words, drugs were believed to literally be a path to social change. Many of us believe that part of the credit for our insight into the nature of America's social and political hypocrisy was a result of our involvement with drugs. I mean, even the Beatle, Paul McCartney, summarized this ideology perfectly in a comment he made to Life magazine in 1967. He said this, "After I took LSD, it opened my eyes. We only use 1/10 of our brain. Just think what all we could accomplish if we could only tap that hidden part. It would mean a whole new world. If the politicians would take LSD, there wouldn't be any more war or poverty or famine." I mean, did you hear that? We thought politicians should drop acid instead of taking bribes. It was that simple. But there was a serious flaw in our better living through chemistry approach to life. I mean, did you catch it? For some reason it didn't last and it couldn't be explained to anyone, much less translated into pedestrian level life on a real planet. I can never forget spending an entire evening wasted beyond belief on some opiated hash studying the surface of an orange. I'm serious. I honestly believed that I had discovered a mathematical theorem that would change the world. Of course, when morning came, I had a terrible time explaining my radical discovery to anyone with a functioning brain. There went my Nobel Prize. Some of the heavy drug users and even the dealers on our campus who became Christians in the early 70s actually brought this ideology about drugs into their new faith. They were going to buy property in northern Wisconsin, raise some dope, bring unbelievers to the farm and get them high so they'd be more open to the gospel. Seriously, it's ludicrous in hindsight, but it's a powerful testimony to just how deeply the belief in this redemptive power of drugs had permeated our generation. And these weren't merely the random adolescent musings trying to work their way up. This ideology was also coming from the top down. Listen to what Timothy Leary, the Harvard sociology professor turned drug guru, said about LSD, or as we called it, acid. LSD is Western yoga. The aim of all Eastern religion, like the aim of LSD, is basically to get high. That is, to expand your consciousness and find ecstasy and revelation within. And Leary's partner in crime was a guy named Ken Kesey, famously known for his acid parties. And he made it even more clear, even though it's a little harder to follow. He said this: the first drug trips were for most of us shell-shattering ordeals that left us blinking knee-deep in the cracked crusts of our pie-in-the-sky personalities. Suddenly people were stripped before one another, and behold, we were beautiful. Naked and helpless and sensitive as a snake after skinning, but far more human than that shining nightmare that had stood creaking in previous parade rest. We were alive, and life was with us. Kesey's flowery metaphors were typical of those who had broken over to what they called the other side, and then come back with tales of marvel to tell us, and of course to sell us. The appeal of drugs was enhanced by Kesey and those like him who spoke kind of a foreign language of hallucinogenic drugs. It served to create a sort of we-they phenomenon in which they possessed all the wisdom and insight that we needed. Kesey's philosophy was further bolstered by the presence of two supergroups of the era that played at all of his parties. They were called the Grateful Dead and Jefferson Airplane. As a matter of fact, much of the music of the decade also carried this call to turn on to drugs. Jimi Hendrix sang about a purple haze in his brain that changed his perception of things. Steppenwolf had a song called Magic Carpet Ride that talked about being taken places where you couldn't normally go. Even the Beatles' Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, that's LSD in the title there, described a land no one outside of hallucinogenic drugs could ever imagine, speaking of a boat drifting down a river bordered by tangerine trees and marmalade skies. Even the Jefferson Airplane's hit White Rabbit talked about drug experiences in terms of allusions to the classic tale of Alice in Wonderland. There were songs that explicitly promoted drugs and drug taking, but there was also kind of this abundance of musicians whose music it was commonly accepted to be best appreciated when you were high listening to it. Even the Doors took their name from Aldous Huxley's poem about mescaline called The Doors of Perception. A group called the Moody Blues and the later Beatles also fit into this category of drug music. Matter of fact, when asked what type of lifestyle the Sgt. Pepper album was portraying, Paul McCartney made this comment: drugs, basically. They got reflected in our music. Remember, drug taking in 1967 was much more in the musician's tradition. We'd heard of Ellington and Basie and jazz guys smoking a little bit of pot, and now it arrived on our music scene. It started to find its way into everything we did, really. It colored our perceptions. Drugs were as ubiquitous as rock music and usually as accessible. We considered the Catholic priest on our campus cool because he got high with the rest of us. We never felt the need to question his orientation, even when he allowed the Newman Center on campus to be used for seminars on witchcraft taught by one of the English professors. The taking of drugs somehow preempted the need for any kind of logic and consistency because we were living on a higher plane and consequently had a better view of reality than they had. Sometimes you can be so open-minded your brain falls out. Well, what about the church in Middle America during the 60s? What was happening with conservative evangelicalism? Well, predictably, the near identification of God and the gospel with America in the 50s bore some very unfortunate fruit in the 60s. The counterculture, with all its crazy clothes, loud music, loose morals, and recreational drug use, couldn't have been more un-American. We were perceived as the enemies of God by a lot of religious adults, whether they were Christian or otherwise. We were not a mission field to be reached, but a people group to be avoided. An attitude of religious self-righteousness prevailed for the most part in the church culture. With a few exceptions like Chuck Smith and the Jesus People on the West Coast, it was tough to find anyone who was willing to look past the way we looked. I mean, I weighed about 95 pounds, had an enormous afro, and I looked more like a Tootsie Pop than a college student. All right, let me just share two experiences on our campus in Wisconsin that'll help clarify what I'm talking about. One of the guys that came to faith in Jesus had the nickname Bummer. He was tall, had hair down to the middle of his back, wore knee-high moccasins. He had leather bags and feathers hanging all over him. He had a leather hat. And the day after he committed his life to Jesus, he went to church at the local Baptist church. And I think it was the first time he'd gone to church ever. And two deacons saw him coming, and with one on each arm, they spun him around and escorted him out of the church. And they said, "Your kind isn't welcome here." Now, that's not the best introduction to the family of God. Or how about this? On another occasion, the one pastor in town who had embraced us and was grateful for our newly found faith invited a black choir to sing at his church. And the whole front row that Sunday was filled with us newbie Christians, and we were literally on our feet, beloved, singing along and blown away by the talent expressing praise. That pastor nearly lost his job for that choice. And one of the elders said to him as he left the church that day that God knew what he was doing when he made everything after its own kind. Those black folk were a different kind, and they belonged by themselves. Again, that was not the best introduction to Christianity for a whole bunch of ex-dopers. The Church of Middle America had offended the youth culture for all the wrong reasons. Rather than seeing themselves as an outpost of heaven, children of God who happened to have been born in America, they saw themselves as American Christians. The Pledge of Allegiance may have become more important than the Great Commission, or maybe even the Great Commandment for that matter. It was also right about this time, I mentioned it earlier, 1951, Campus Crusade for Christ and the Navigators were both kind of launched on college campuses. The 60s saw a literal explosion that went on into the 70s of parachurch ministry on the college campuses. We are so deeply grateful, so many of us, that those parachurch organizations were able to look beyond our costumes to our hearts and help disciple us. A lot of them helped us walk out of the lifestyles we had embraced and helped us embrace the gospel. Okay, the 60s was a complex time, and understanding it in retrospect is honestly difficult, but the threads that were loose and dangling as the 50s ended became tightly woven into a discernible tapestry lifestyle during the 60s. And as the 60s drew to a close, it appeared if for only a moment that wisdom actually did reside with the youth of America. Maybe it was true that all you need is love. Or maybe not.